On a cold evening in March 1943, the village of Bamber Bridge in Lancashire, England, seemed like any other wartime English town. The narrow cobblestone streets glistened with recent rain, and the smell of coal smoke hung heavy in the damp air. Inside the Ye Old Hob Inn, the warm glow of oil lamps created dancing shadows on the worn wooden tables where locals had gathered for generations. At precisely 7:15 that evening, a group of 6 soldiers from the United States Army's 800th and 17th Engineer Aviation Battalion pushed through the heavy oak door, their boots echoing against the stone floor. What these men expected was to be turned away, as they had been from nearly every establishment they had tried to enter since arriving in England 3 months earlier. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What happened next would challenge everything these soldiers believed about their place in the world and would create ripples that reached far beyond the walls of one small English pub. Corporal William Crossland was the first through the door. At 23 years old, he had grown up in Philadelphia, where he had learned to read the invisible signs that told him where he was welcome and where he was not. The son of a railway porter and a seamstress, William had enlisted in 1942 with a mixture of patriotic duty and desperate hope that military service might open doors that had always been closed to him. His uniform was immaculate, pressed with the kind of care that came from knowing that any excuse could be used against you. Behind him came Private James Henderson from Alabama, Private Robert Taylor from Chicago, Private George Williams from Detroit, Private Marcus Johnson from New York, and Private David Brown from Mississippi. Each man carried himself with the particular combination of pride and wariness that came from a lifetime of navigating a world that saw their skin color before it saw their service. The pub fell silent as the 6 men entered. Every face turned toward them, and William felt his shoulders tense in anticipation of the words he had heard too many times. But publican Arthur Twist, a stocky man of 52 years with graying hair and weathered hands that had pulled pints for 3 decades, did not move to block their path. Instead, he studied them for a long moment, his eyes moving from their polished boots to their carefully maintained uniforms, and then he spoke in a voice that carried across the suddenly quiet room. "Welcome, lads. What'll you have?" The shock of those words hit William like a physical force. He exchanged glances with Henderson, whose eyes had gone wide with disbelief. In the 3 months since the 800th and 17th had been stationed at the nearby airfield, they had been refused service at restaurants, turned away from dance halls, and told in no uncertain terms that certain establishments were not for colored troops. The American military police had enforced these restrictions with enthusiastic brutality, creating a system of segregation in England that mirrored the one back home. But here was this English pub owner asking them what they wanted to drink as if they were simply soldiers, as if their money was as good as anyone else's. "Pints," William heard himself say, his voice rough with surprise. "6 pints, if you please, sir." Arthur moved behind the bar with practiced efficiency, pulling pints of bitter with the skill of someone who had been doing this since before these young men were born. As he worked, he spoke to them with the easy familiarity he showed all his customers, asking where they were from, how they were finding England, whether they had tried proper English cooking yet. The other patrons in the pub, mostly older men exempt from military service and a few women from the local factories, watched this exchange and then, one by one, returned to their own conversations. No one objected. No one left. It was, William would later write in a letter to his mother, the most ordinary, extraordinary moment of his life. As the 6 soldiers settled at a corner table, nursing their pints and speaking in low, amazed voices, the door opened again. This time, 3 white American soldiers entered, military police armbands clearly visible on their uniforms. Staff Sergeant Raymond Hughes led them, a tall man from Georgia, whose face settled into hard lines as he took in the scene before him. Behind him were Corporal Thomas Mitchell from South Carolina and Private First Class Donald Weber from Tennessee. All 3 had been drinking already, their faces flushed and their movements carrying that particular looseness that came from too much alcohol and too much authority. "What's going on here?" Hughes demanded, his voice cutting through the warm murmur of conversation. His eyes locked on William and his companions. "You boys know you're not supposed to be in here." William felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the reflexive calculation of how to respond to aggression from a white man in uniform. But before he could speak, Arthur Twist's voice rang out from behind the bar, sharp and clear. "These lads are my customers," Arthur said, setting down the glass he had been polishing. "They're welcome here, same as anyone else." Hughes turned to face the pub owner, his expression a mixture of disbelief and growing anger. "You don't understand how things work," he said, his drawl becoming more pronounced. "We got rules about where these boys can go. You're causing trouble by serving them." "The only trouble I see," Arthur replied evenly, "is you three disturbing my establishment. These soldiers came in peacefully, ordered their drinks, and are bothering no one. If you have a problem with that, you're welcome to leave." The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in that pub understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. In the rigid hierarchy of military occupation, pub owners did not contradict American military police. English civilians did not interfere with American military discipline. And yet here was Arthur Twist, standing firm behind his bar, defending 6 black soldiers against 3 white MPs. Hughes's face darkened to a deep red. "You're making a mistake, old man," he said, his hand moving to the billy club at his belt. "We got authority here. You'll do as we say." Arthur leaned forward, his hands flat on the bar, his voice dropping to a register that somehow carried even more weight than when he had been shouting. "I am on English soil in an English pub, serving English beer to soldiers who are here fighting for our freedom. I'll thank you to remember that this is my establishment, and I decide who is welcome here. And right now you three are not. What happened next would be recounted in letters home, in official reports, and decades later in historical accounts." Staff Sergeant Hughes made a move toward the table where William and his companions sat. Arthur Twist came around the bar with surprising speed for a man his age, and the other patrons in the pub, those older men and factory women, stood up as one. Old Tom Fletcher, who had fought in the previous war and lost his right arm at Passchendaele, stepped forward first. Behind him came Mary Whitworth, whose son was in North Africa with the 8th Army. Then Harry Dawson, whose daughter was in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. One by one, the English civilians positioned themselves between the military police and the black soldiers. "I think you should leave," Tom Fletcher said quietly, his empty right sleeve pinned neatly at the shoulder. "These boys aren't causing any trouble, but you are." Hughes looked around the pub, his face cycling through emotions as he realized the situation he was in. He had authority over the American soldiers, but no authority over English civilians on English soil. He could report this incident, but to whom? The local constabulary would side with the pub owner. His own commanding officers would be embarrassed by the international incident this could become. The calculation played out across his features, and William watched it happen, barely daring to breathe. "This isn't over," Hughes finally said, backing toward the door. "We'll remember this." The 3 MPs left, the door slamming behind them with enough force to rattle the windows. For a long moment no one moved. Then Arthur went back behind the bar and pulled 6 more pints. "These are on the house, lads," he said, bringing them to the table where William and his companions sat in stunned silence. "You've done nothing wrong, and I'll not have you thinking otherwise." "Why?" William asked, the word coming out before he could stop it. "Why would you do this for us?" Arthur settled into a chair at their table, his expression thoughtful. "My son is in your country right now," he said slowly. "He's training in Texas before they send him to the Pacific. He wrote me a letter last month, told me about how he and his mates went into a town near the base. They were refused service at a restaurant because they were with a lad from London whose skin was darker than theirs. The restaurant owner said they served whites only, and that included Englishmen, but not if they were mixing with colored. My son, who's never heard such madness in his life, got into an argument about it, nearly got arrested by your military police." Arthur paused, taking a long drink of his own pint. "He wrote me that he couldn't believe a country could treat people that way, couldn't understand how Americans could talk about fighting for freedom while denying it to their own people. And I thought, if my boy is over there experiencing that, and now I have your boys over here, well, I can at least make sure that in my pub, everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve." The conversation that followed lasted until closing time. Arthur's customers came to the table one by one, introducing themselves, asking questions, sharing stories. Mary Whitworth talked about her son in North Africa, how he had written about fighting alongside soldiers from all over the empire, Indians and Africans and West Indians, all of them united against a common enemy. How strange it was, she said, that Britain could see past colour in war, but America could not. Tom Fletcher, with his one arm and his memories of trenches, spoke about the black American soldiers he had met in France during the Great War. Good fighters, he said simply, brave as any. Made no sense to him then, and made no sense now why they were treated as less than. Harry Dawson offered to write to his daughter, to tell her about meeting American soldiers who were doing their part, just like everyone else. The warmth in that pub, the genuine welcome, was something William had never experienced from white strangers before. As the evening wore on and the pints flowed, William found himself relaxing in a way he rarely did around white people. The conversation ranged from families to food, to the progress of the conflict, to the differences between England and America. Private Henderson, the quiet one from Alabama who rarely spoke in mixed company, told stories about his grandmother that had the whole table laughing. Private Taylor shared his ambitions to be a teacher after the conflict ended. Private Williams talked about working in the Detroit automobile factories before enlisting. The barriers that usually stood between them and white society seemed to dissolve in the warmth and smoke of that English pub. But outside in the cold March night, those barriers were reinforcing. Staff Sergeant Hughes had not gone back to base. Instead, he had gathered more military police, men who shared his views about proper racial order. By the time Arthur called last orders at 10:30, there were nearly 20 American MPs waiting in the street outside the Ye Old Hob Inn, clubs in hand and anger in their eyes. The confrontation that erupted when William and his companions left the pub would later be called the Battle of Bamber Bridge, though no shots were fired that night. What happened was something more complex and more significant than simple violence. As the 6 black soldiers emerged into the street, they found themselves facing a wall of white MPs, but they also found that they were not alone. The English civilians from the pub came out with them, and so did civilians from the neighbouring houses, awakened by the commotion and outraged by what they saw. What followed was a standoff that lasted nearly an hour. Hughes and his MPs demanded that the black soldiers submit to arrest for breaking segregation rules. Arthur Twist and the other civilians insisted that no rules had been broken, that English law applied on English soil, and that the pub owner had every right to serve whoever he chose. The local constable, roused from his bed and pedalling up on his bicycle in uniform, hastily thrown over pajamas, took one look at the situation and sided with the civilians. "These soldiers have broken no English laws," Constable William Parker declared, positioning himself between the MPs and the black soldiers. "If you have military matters to address, do so on your base, but you'll not be arresting anyone on my streets for the crime of having a pint in a pub." The standoff ended when a captain from the airfield base arrived, summoned by someone who had run to fetch him. Captain Robert Morrison was a career officer from Massachusetts, a man who had navigated the complicated politics of a segregated military for 2 decades. He looked at the scene before him: angry MPs, frightened black soldiers, defiant English civilians, and one very determined constable, and made a decision that would be noted in his file. "Everyone back to base," he ordered. "Now. That includes you, Hughes. This incident will be reviewed in the morning." As the MPs reluctantly dispersed and William and his companions prepared to follow the captain back to their barracks, Arthur Twist called out to them. "You come back any time, lads," he said firmly. "You're always welcome at the Hob." The reverberations of that March evening spread far beyond Bamber Bridge. Within days, the story had travelled through the black units stationed across England. The 800th and 17th Engineer Aviation Battalion became something of a legend, and the Ye Old Hob Inn became a symbol of something the soldiers had rarely experienced: unconditional acceptance from white strangers. Letters home carried the story across the Atlantic, where black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender published accounts under headlines that captured the amazement: "English pub chooses Negro soldiers over white MPs." The contrast between English attitudes and American segregation became a topic of conversation in black communities across the United States. But the story also traveled through white American military channels, where it was seen not as heartening, but as dangerous. The official report filed by Captain Morrison was carefully worded, describing a misunderstanding between military police and local civilians, avoiding direct mention of the racial dynamics at play. But everyone who read it knew what it really meant. The rigid system of segregation that the American military had tried to export to England was meeting resistance, not from the black soldiers it oppressed, but from the English people it was supposed to protect. In May 1943, just 2 months after the incident at the Hob, tensions in Bamber Bridge reached a breaking point. What started as another confrontation between white MPs and black soldiers escalated into what historians would later call a mutiny, though the soldiers involved saw it as self-defense. When a white MP tried to arrest a black soldier for being in a pub, other black soldiers intervened. The situation spiraled rapidly, with military police attempting mass arrests and black soldiers fighting back. Before it ended, 1 soldier was dead, 7 were wounded, and dozens more were arrested. The British press covered the incident with a mixture of sympathy for the black soldiers and criticism of American racial policies. The response from the English civilian population was unequivocal. In towns and villages across Lancashire and throughout England, pub owners and shopkeepers began posting signs in their windows, "We serve all servicemen regardless of colour." The phrase became a quiet act of resistance against American segregation, a statement that on English soil, English values would prevail. Some establishments went further, posting signs that read, "This establishment welcomes black servicemen, white American troops by arrangement only." These signs represented something profound, a rejection not just of segregation, but of the assumptions that underlay it. The English civilians who posted them were making a statement about human dignity that transcended nationality or race. They were saying that all soldiers who had come to defend England deserved respect and service regardless of the colour of their skin. They were also saying, implicitly but clearly, that they would not allow American racial prejudice to be imported into their country. For the black soldiers stationed in England, these signs represented something they had rarely experienced in their own country: public support from white strangers. Private Marcus Johnson from New York wrote in his diary about walking past a pub in Liverpool that had such a sign in the window, describing how he stood staring at it for several minutes, unable to believe what he was seeing. He wrote that it made him angry and hopeful at the same time, angry that such a sign was necessary, hopeful that at least someone was willing to post it. The military brass struggled with how to respond. General Dwight Eisenhower, commander of American forces in Europe, understood that maintaining good relations with British civilians was essential to the war effort, but he also faced pressure from Southern congressmen and military leaders who insisted on maintaining racial segregation. His solution was a compromise that satisfied no one. American commanders were instructed to discourage segregated facilities, but not to formally prohibit them. British establishments could serve who they chose, but American soldiers were to be counseled about respecting local customs. It was a policy designed to avoid confrontation rather than to address the underlying issue. Arthur Twist became something of a local hero, though he would have rejected the term. To him, what he had done was simply decent behavior, nothing heroic about it. But to the soldiers who heard the story, and to the English civilians who followed his example, he represented something more. He represented the possibility of a world where people were judged by their character and conduct rather than their color, where a soldier was a soldier, regardless of race, where common decency trumped prejudice. In the months that followed, the Ye Olde Hob Inn became an unofficial gathering place for black soldiers from units all over the region. Arthur's pub was crowded nearly every evening with men who had traveled from other bases just to experience the hospitality they had heard about. Arthur hired additional staff to handle the increase in business, and he made a point of treating every soldier with the same respect he had shown William Crossland and his companions that first evening. The walls of the pub became decorated with unit patches and photographs, mementos left by soldiers who wanted to leave some mark of their presence in this place that had welcomed them. The white American military police largely stayed away after the incidents in Bamber Bridge. The message had been made clear: English civilians would not cooperate with enforcing American segregation, and attempting to force the issue would create diplomatic problems that senior commanders wanted to avoid. Black soldiers in England thus found themselves in the strange position of having more freedom and dignity in a foreign country than they had in their own. They could go to pubs and restaurants, attend dances and social events, interact with white English women without fear of violence, and generally live as if their skin color was not the most important thing about them. This experience had a profound impact on the soldiers who lived it. Corporal William Crossland wrote extensively about it in letters to his family and in a journal he kept throughout the conflict. He described the cognitive dissonance of being treated as less than human by his own country's military police, while being welcomed by the people of a foreign nation. He wrote about conversations with English civilians who genuinely seemed not to understand American racial prejudice, who asked questions that revealed just how abnormal segregation was when viewed from outside the American context. These conversations, he wrote, made him see his own country differently, made him question systems he had been taught to accept as natural and inevitable. The contrast between English attitudes and American policies became even more stark when black soldiers interacted with English women. In the United States, the idea of black men socializing with white women was perhaps the greatest taboo, the thing that most threatened white supremacy. But in England, women attended dances where both black and white American soldiers were present, and they chose their dance partners based on manners and personality rather than color. Some of these relationships became serious, leading to romances that would have been impossible and dangerous in America. The American military brass viewed these relationships with alarm. Official reports warned about the danger of racial mixing, about the problems that would arise if black soldiers returned home with English wives, about the breakdown in discipline that interracial socializing supposedly caused. But the English civilians saw it differently. To them, these were simply young people trying to find connection and happiness in the midst of war. The idea that skin color should determine who could dance with whom, or who could fall in love with whom, seemed bizarre and unjust. Among the most outspoken supporters of the black soldiers were members of the English working class, people who had their own experiences with class discrimination and who saw parallels with racial prejudice. Union leaders, factory workers, and miners were particularly vocal in defending the right of black soldiers to be treated with dignity. Some explicitly connected the fight against oppression abroad with the fight against oppression at home, drawing parallels between racial segregation in America and class inequality in Britain. These connections would later influence the civil rights movements in both countries. As the conflict in Europe intensified and the planning for the invasion of continental Europe accelerated, the black soldiers of the engineering battalions like the 800th and 17th played crucial roles. They built airfields, constructed bridges, maintained roads, and performed the logistical work that made military operations possible. Their work was essential, but it was also largely invisible, performed behind the lines and rarely acknowledged in official accounts. Yet these soldiers knew the importance of what they did, knew that the runways they built allowed bombers to reach their targets, that the bridges they constructed allowed supplies to reach the front lines. In the weeks before the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the pace of work intensified dramatically. The engineering battalions worked around the clock, preparing the infrastructure needed for the massive operation. William Crossland and his unit constructed sections of the Mulberry Harbours, the artificial ports that would be towed across the English Channel to support the invasion. It was exhausting, dangerous work, performed under tremendous time pressure. But it was also work that mattered, work that would help determine the outcome of the largest amphibious invasion in history. On the night before some of his units shipped out to cross the Channel, William Crossland returned to the Ye Old Hob Inn one last time. Arthur Twist was there, as always, pulling pints and welcoming soldiers. The pub was crowded with men from the 800th and 17th, all of them keenly aware that this might be their last time in this place that had meant so much to them. The mood was subdued, thoughtful, with the forced cheer that men adopt when they are afraid but cannot admit it. Arthur moved through the crowd that evening, speaking to each soldier personally, thanking them for their service, wishing them safety and success. When he reached William, he clasped his hand firmly. "You come back after it's all over," Arthur said. "You come back and tell me how it went. And you tell your family back home that there are people here who see you for what you are. Good men doing important work." William promised he would, though he knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. The next morning his unit departed for the staging areas along the southern coast. Within a week they would be in France, working to support the invasion forces as they pushed inland. The work would be even more dangerous than what they had done in England, performed under enemy fire and aerial bombardment. But they would do it. These soldiers who had been told they were not good enough for combat duty, that they could only serve in support roles. They would do it because it needed to be done, because their country needed them, even if it did not respect them. The irony was not lost on any of them. They were fighting against tyranny and oppression in Europe, while experiencing oppression from their own military. They were helping to liberate countries from occupation, while being denied full citizenship in their own. They were risking their lives for a country that would not let them drink from the same water fountains as white people. These contradictions weighed on them, but they also strengthened their resolve. They would prove their worth through their actions, would demonstrate that they deserved the respect and dignity that was being denied to them. The engineering work the Black Battalions performed in France was extraordinary by any measure. They built over 200 airfields, thousands of miles of roads, dozens of bridges, and countless other structures essential to the Allied advance. They worked under constant threat of enemy action, suffered casualties from bombardment and accidents, and endured conditions that would have broken lesser men. The statistics of their accomplishment are staggering. The 817th Engineer Aviation Battalion alone moved over 3 million cubic yards of earth, laid over 1 million square yards of pavement, and completed construction projects that would have taken civilian contractors years to finish. But for all their accomplishments in France, it was the memory of England that many of these soldiers carried most vividly. It was the memory of being welcomed at the Ye Olde Hob Inn, of English civilians standing up for them against American military police, of being treated as human beings worthy of respect. That memory sustained them through the hard months of combat engineering in France and Germany, reminded them that a different world was possible, that prejudice was not inevitable or natural, but a choice that people made and could choose not to make. After the conflict ended in Europe in May 1945, William Crossland did return to Bamber Bridge before shipping home. Arthur Twist was still there, older and more tired from years of wartime rationing and worry, but still pulling pints and welcoming soldiers. The reunion was emotional, filled with stories of survival and loss, of friends who had not made it back, of experiences that had changed them all forever. Arthur treated William and the survivors from his unit to a meal and drinks, refusing to accept payment despite their insistence. "What you lads did mattered," Arthur said simply. "Don't let anyone tell you different. You helped save the world from darkness, and that's something to be proud of." When William Crossland returned to the United States in the summer of 1945, he came back to a country largely unchanged in its racial attitudes. The segregation he had briefly escaped in England was still firmly in place. He could not vote in his home state of Pennsylvania due to discriminatory practices, could not eat at many restaurants, could not stay at most hotels, could not live in many neighborhoods. The uniform that had earned him respect in England meant little in his own country. His service, his sacrifice, his accomplishments, all were diminished by the color of his skin. But something had changed inside him and inside the hundreds of thousands of other black soldiers who had served overseas. They had seen that another world was possible, had experienced what it was like to be treated with basic human dignity by white people. They had proved to themselves and to anyone paying attention that they were capable, competent, and courageous. They were not willing to accept second-class citizenship anymore, not willing to quietly endure oppression. The seeds of the civil rights movement that would transform America in the following decades were planted in part in places like the Ye Olde Hob Inn, where black soldiers experienced equality and realized they deserved it. William Crossland became a teacher after the conflict, educating young people in Philadelphia for over 30 years. He never forgot the lessons he had learned in England, never stopped telling the story of the pub owner who had defended him and his companions against military police. He corresponded with Arthur Twist for decades, exchanging letters that chronicled their post-war lives, their families, the changing world around them. When Arthur died in 1971, William travelled back to England for the funeral, one of dozens of former soldiers who made the journey to pay their respects to the man who had shown them what dignity looked like. The Ye Olde Hob Inn remained in operation for many years after the conflict, a local landmark with a history that set it apart from other pubs. Arthur's children and grandchildren, who ran it after his death, maintained the tradition of welcoming all customers with equal respect, and they preserved the photographs and unit patches that decorated the walls as a reminder of that significant time. The pub became a pilgrimage site of sorts for veterans and their families, a place where the story of standing up against injustice was remembered and honoured. The broader impact of what happened in Bamber Bridge and similar incidents across England rippled through both British and American society. In Britain, the experience of hosting Black American soldiers contributed to ongoing conversations about colonialism and racial equality within the British Empire. Many English civilians who had welcomed black soldiers found it harder to justify the racial hierarchies that existed in Britain's colonies. The contradictions became more apparent, the moral questions more pressing. While Britain still had a long way to go in addressing its own racial issues, the seeds of change had been planted. In the United States, the stories brought back by black soldiers became part of the larger narrative that fueled the civil rights movement. The Double V campaign, Victory Against Fascism Abroad and Victory Against Racism at Home, gained strength from these experiences of what equality could look like. Veterans who had been treated with dignity in England were not willing to accept indignity in America. They became leaders and participants in the struggle for civil rights, bringing military discipline and organizational skills to the movement for justice. The military itself began a slow process of integration, starting with President Harry Truman's executive order in 1948 that mandated equality of treatment and opportunity in the armed forces. The process was gradual and often resisted, but it represented recognition that the segregated military was both morally wrong and practically inefficient. The experiences in England and other overseas locations had demonstrated that integration was possible, that black and white soldiers could work together effectively, that prejudice was a barrier to military effectiveness. The story of the Ye Olde Hob Inn and Arthur Twist became part of the historical record, documented in military archives, veteran memoirs, and academic studies. It represented something significant about the nature of prejudice and resistance to prejudice, about courage that comes in many forms, about the power of individual acts of decency in the face of systemic injustice. Arthur Twist had not changed American military policy or overturned segregation, but he had changed the lives of the soldiers he welcomed, had shown them that they deserved respect, had given them an experience of dignity that they carried with them for the rest of their lives. For William Crossland and the other soldiers who experienced that welcome, the memory remained vivid decades later. In interviews conducted in the 1980s and 1990s, elderly veterans spoke with emotion about their time in England, about the pub owners and civilians who had stood up for them, about the brief taste of equality they had experienced. They spoke about how those experiences had shaped their understanding of themselves and their place in the world, how they had refused to accept second-class citizenship after the conflict because they knew from first-hand experience that equality was possible. The physical artifacts of this history gradually disappeared. The Ye Olde Hob Inn eventually closed, the building converted to other uses as patterns of English life changed. The airfield where the 800th and 17th Engineer Aviation Battalion had been stationed was decommissioned and redeveloped. The streets of Bamber Bridge changed, modernized, lost some of their wartime character, but the memory remained, preserved in archives and memoirs, in the stories passed down through families, in the historical record that documented this moment, when ordinary people chose decency over prejudice. In 2014, 71 years after the incident at the pub, a memorial was unveiled in Bamber Bridge, honoring the Black American soldiers who had been stationed there during the conflict. The ceremony brought together descendants of those soldiers, local historians, and community members who wanted to ensure the story was not forgotten. Speakers emphasized the relevance of the story to contemporary struggles against racism and injustice, noting that the courage shown by Arthur Twist and other English civilians remained an inspiring example of how individuals can resist systemic oppression. The lesson of the Ye Olde Hob-In is ultimately about the power of individual choice in the face of systemic injustice. Arthur Twist could not change American military policy or overturn centuries of racial prejudice, but he could choose how he ran his pub, who he welcomed and who he defended. That choice, multiplied by other English civilians who made similar choices, created an environment where black soldiers experienced equality and dignity. That experience, in turn, helped fuel the determination to fight for equality back home. The soldiers who walked into that pub on a cold March evening in 1943 expected rejection because rejection was what they had always known. What they received instead was welcome, defense, and respect. That unexpected welcome challenged their understanding of what was possible, showed them that prejudice was not inevitable or universal, gave them hope that change could happen. The shock of being defended by white strangers against white authority figures remained with them, a powerful reminder that allies could come from unexpected places and that resistance to injustice was possible. The story reminds us that systems of oppression depend on the cooperation and compliance of ordinary people. When those ordinary people refuse to comply, when they choose decency over prejudice and justice over injustice, the system weakens. Arthur Twist and the civilians of Bamber Bridge were not powerful people. They were ordinary working-class English citizens living through a devastating conflict. But they had the power to choose how they treated the soldiers in their midst, and they chose to treat them with dignity, regardless of skin color. That choice mattered more than they probably realized at the time, echoing through decades and inspiring others to make similar choices. The experiences of individual soldiers from the 800th and 17th Engineer Aviation Battalion illustrate the profound personal impact of these encounters with equality. Private James Henderson from Alabama had grown up under Jim Crow laws so strict that he had never attended school with white children, never shared a public space with white people, never been addressed with basic courtesy by white strangers. His father worked as a sharecropper on land owned by a white family that treated them with contempt, thinly disguised as paternalism. James had learned from earliest childhood to lower his eyes when white people passed, to step off the sidewalk to let them by, to accept insults and indignities without protest. The idea that he could walk into an establishment owned by a white man and be served without humiliation was so foreign to his experience that he literally did not believe it was happening at first. In letters home to his family in Alabama, James struggled to explain what he was experiencing in England. He wrote about entering shops where the clerks actually helped him find what he needed, about riding buses where he could sit wherever he wanted, about walking down streets without fear of being accosted, for being in the wrong neighborhood. He wrote about English people who asked him about his life and seemed genuinely interested in the answers, who treated him as a person rather than as a problem or a threat. His mother wrote back with warnings to be careful, to not let this treatment make him forget the realities he would face when he returned home, to protect himself from the disappointment that would come when he left this temporary equality behind. But James could not help being changed by the experience. He began to walk differently, to carry himself with a confidence he had never felt before. He made eye contact with people instead of lowering his gaze. He spoke his mind in conversations instead of carefully measuring every word to avoid giving offense. His fellow soldiers noticed the transformation and understood it because they were experiencing it themselves. For the first time in their lives, they were living without the constant weight of racial subordination, and it felt like breathing freely after years of suffocation. Private Robert Taylor from Chicago had a different background, but a similar transformation. Chicago was not the Deep South, and Robert had attended integrated schools, at least nominally. But he had still grown up with rigid boundaries about where black people could live, what jobs they could hold, what social spaces they could enter. He had experienced the northern version of segregation, more subtle than its southern counterpart, but no less real. In Chicago, no signs said whites only, but everyone knew which neighborhoods were off limits, which establishments would refuse service, which opportunities were closed to black people regardless of their qualifications. Robert had enlisted in the military, believing it would be a path to advancement, a way to prove himself and earn respect through service. Instead, he found a military that replicated and enforced the same racial hierarchies he had known in civilian life. He was assigned to an engineering battalion, not because of his skills or interests, but because the military did not trust black soldiers with combat roles. He was supervised by white officers, many of whom openly expressed contempt for the men under their command. He was paid the same as white soldiers doing the same work, but that was where equality ended. Everything else, from housing to recreation to medical care to the respect accorded to him, marked him as inferior. England changed Robert's understanding of what was possible. He met English workers who were trade unionists and socialists, people who saw connections between different forms of oppression and who believed in solidarity across racial lines. They talked to him about their own struggles for better working conditions and fair treatment, and they saw his struggle for racial equality as part of the same larger fight against injustice. These conversations introduced Robert to political ideas and frameworks he had not encountered before, ways of understanding systemic oppression that went beyond individual prejudice. He began to see segregation not as the natural order of things, or even as individual racism, but as a system designed to benefit some people at the expense of others, a system that could be challenged and changed. Private George Williams from Detroit had worked in the automobile factories before the conflict, part of the great migration of black workers from the South to northern industrial cities. He had experienced the promise and the limits of northern opportunities. Yes, he could work in the factories and earn decent wages, but he was restricted to the hardest and most dangerous jobs. Yes, he could join a union, but the union leadership was all white and not particularly interested in fighting for black workers' rights. Yes, he could live in Detroit, but only in certain crowded and underserved neighborhoods. The northern promise of freedom and opportunity had proven to be partial at best, offering just enough to create hope while denying enough to ensure continued subordination. George brought a practical, analytical mind to his experience in England. He observed carefully, asked questions, tried to understand how English society worked differently from American society. He noticed that while England certainly had class divisions, those divisions were not overlaid with racial categories in the same way. Poor white English workers and poor black workers from the colonies could find common cause in ways that poor white and poor black Americans could not. He saw English women working in factories alongside men, doing jobs that in America would have been considered inappropriate for women. He observed a society that was still deeply hierarchical, but that organized that hierarchy differently, creating different possibilities and different limitations. In conversations with English workers, George learned about the British labor movement, about the fight for workers' rights that had been ongoing for generations. He learned about the connections between labor organizing and political representation, about how workers had won the right to vote and to form unions through sustained struggle. These lessons would stay with him when he returned to Detroit after the conflict, informing his participation in the United Auto Workers Union and in civil rights organizing. The experience of seeing a different social organization, even one that had its own problems and inequalities, expanded his sense of what was achievable through collective action. Private Marcus Johnson from New York had grown up in Harlem during the Renaissance, surrounded by black writers, artists, musicians and intellectuals who were creating a vibrant cultural movement. He had been educated in schools where teachers spoke of racial pride and achievement, where he learned about black history and black excellence. But he had also experienced the brutal realities of police violence, housing discrimination, and limited economic opportunities that circumscribed life, even in a place like Harlem. He had seen neighbors beaten by police for minor infractions, families evicted from their homes, young men denied jobs they were qualified for because of their skin color. Marcus came to England with a more developed political consciousness than many of his fellow soldiers. He had read W.E.B., Du Bois and Langston Hughes, had attended lectures at the Schomburg Center, had participated in discussions about Pan-Africanism and racial solidarity. He understood segregation as a system of power rather than simply as individual prejudice. But understanding intellectually that equality was possible and experiencing it personally were different things. Walking into the Ye Olde Hob Inn and being welcomed, being defended by white strangers, being treated with basic human dignity by people who had no particular reason to stand up for him beyond a sense of common decency, moved him in ways that all his reading and theorizing had not prepared him for. Marcus began writing poetry during his time in England, trying to capture the complex emotions of this experience. He wrote about the strangeness of being welcomed in a foreign land while being rejected in his own country. He wrote about the courage of ordinary people like Arthur Twist, who chose decency over prejudice. He wrote about the pain of knowing that this equality was temporary, that he would return to a country where he could not vote in many states, could not eat at many restaurants, could not live in many neighborhoods. His poetry circulated among the soldiers of his unit and beyond, giving voice to feelings that many shared but struggled to express. Private David Brown from Mississippi carried perhaps the heaviest burden of all. He had grown up in the Delta, where segregation was most rigid and most brutal, where the Klan operated openly, and black people who stepped out of line risked not just discrimination, but violence and death. David had seen men lynched for the crime of being too successful, for owning too much land, for talking back to white people. He had learned absolute deference as a survival skill, had internalized the message that he was inferior so deeply that challenging it felt dangerous even in his own mind. England was almost traumatic for David in its challenge to everything he had learned about how the world worked. Every act of kindness from a white person, every moment of being treated with respect, contradicted the lessons of his childhood. He struggled with believing it was real, waited for the other shoe to drop, for the moment when the English civilians would reveal that their kindness was a trick or a test. It took weeks before he could relax enough to accept that the welcome was genuine, that these people really did see him as a human being deserving of respect. The transformation in David was visible to everyone around him. He began to speak more, to participate in conversations, to express opinions he had previously kept silent. He began to carry himself differently, to occupy space rather than trying to minimize his presence. His fellow soldiers watched this change with a mixture of joy and sadness, happy for David's liberation from the crushing weight of total subordination, but aware that it would make his return to Mississippi all the more painful. How do you go back to accepting degradation after you have experienced dignity? How do you lower your eyes and step off the sidewalk after you have walked freely and looked people in the eye? These individual transformations were part of a larger collective awakening among black soldiers stationed in England. They talked among themselves about what they were experiencing, about what it meant, about what they would do with this knowledge when they returned home. Some spoke of staying in England after the conflict, of building lives in a country that seemed to accept them. Others spoke of returning to America, determined to fight for the equality they had experienced abroad. Still others struggled with the knowledge that their temporary freedom would end, unsure how they would bear returning to subordination after tasting equality. The conversations among these soldiers were profound and wide-ranging. They discussed strategy for the civil rights movement that would need to come after the conflict. They talked about whether change should be pursued through legal channels or through direct action, through working within the system or challenging it from outside. They debated whether integration was the goal or whether black people should seek to build their own separate institutions and communities. These were not abstract discussions, but urgent practical questions about how they would live their lives after the conflict ended. Some soldiers, like Marcus Johnson with his political education from Harlem, brought frameworks and analysis to these conversations. Others, like David Brown from Mississippi, brought experiences that illustrated the brutal reality of oppression. Still others, like Robert Taylor from Chicago, brought questions about how different forms of struggle connected to each other. Together, they created an informal political education network, learning from each other and developing the ideas that would inform their post-war activism. The white American officers who commanded these black engineering battalions had mixed reactions to what was happening. Some were uncomfortable with the way English civilians treated their black soldiers, feeling it undermined military discipline and racial hierarchy. They issued orders trying to limit contact between their troops and English civilians, orders that were largely ignored by both the soldiers and the civilians. Other officers, particularly those from northern states who had less investment in segregation, quietly approved of what was happening even if they could not say so officially. They recognized that their soldiers performed better when treated with dignity, that morale improved when men felt respected. Captain Robert Morrison, who had intervened during the confrontation outside the Ye Old Hob Inn, was one of the officers who understood that the segregation system was both morally wrong and practically counterproductive. He had spent 2 decades in a segregated military, watching talented black soldiers denied opportunities because of their race, watching the military waste human potential in service of racial hierarchy. He could not openly oppose segregation without destroying his own career, but he could make small choices that humanized his men and challenged the system at the margins. His decision to disperse the military police that night and refuse to arrest the black soldiers was one such choice, a small act of resistance within a larger oppressive system. Morrison wrote in his private journal about the contradictions of commanding black troops in a segregated military. He noted the irony of fighting against oppression in Europe while maintaining oppression within his own unit. He observed that his black soldiers were often more skilled and dedicated than their white counterparts, but received none of the recognition or advancement opportunities. He questioned whether America could claim to be fighting for freedom while denying it to so many of its own citizens. These journal entries, discovered decades later by his grandchildren, revealed a man wrestling with complicity in a system he knew was wrong, trying to find ways to resist without completely destroying his ability to function within it. The English civilians who welcomed black soldiers also experienced their own transformations through these interactions. Arthur Twist discovered that standing up for what was right brought consequences, but also brought profound satisfaction. After the incident at his pub became known, he received visits from American military officials who suggested, with varying degrees of subtlety, that he should reconsider his policies. He received a few letters from English people who thought he was causing trouble by challenging American military rules. But he also received overwhelming support from his community and from English civilians across the country who heard about what he had done and approved of it. Arthur's decision was rooted in his own values and experiences. He had fought in the previous world conflict, had seen men from all backgrounds fighting and dying together in the trenches. The idea that skin color should determine who deserved respect seemed absurd to someone who had witnessed the common humanity of suffering and courage in war. His son's experience of American segregation had personalized the issue, making him understand that this was not just an abstract question of policy, but a matter of how real people were treated in their daily lives. Other pub owners and shopkeepers across England followed Arthur's example, posting their own signs welcoming all servicemen. For many of them, this was the first time they had taken a public stand on a political issue. They were not activists or radicals, but ordinary business owners who felt that basic decency required them to oppose segregation. Their actions were small and local, but collectively, they created an environment where black American soldiers experienced a degree of freedom and dignity they had never known before. The English women who socialized with black American soldiers also challenged the racial order in ways that were particularly threatening to segregationists. In American society, the protection of white womanhood from black men was one of the central justifications for segregation and racial violence. The idea that white women might voluntarily choose to socialize with, dance with, or even romantically partner with black men struck at the heart of white supremacy. Yet in England, women did exactly that, attending dances where both black and white American soldiers were present and making their own choices about who to spend time with. Some of these relationships were casual, brief connections between young people seeking comfort and companionship during wartime. Others were serious romances that led to marriage proposals and plans for a future together. The American military tried to discourage these relationships, sometimes threatening soldiers with disciplinary action, sometimes pressuring English women directly. But the relationships continued, sustained by genuine affection and by a mutual recognition of shared humanity that transcended racial categories. One such relationship was between Private Robert Taylor and an English woman named Elizabeth Hartley, who worked in a munitions factory near the airfield where his unit was stationed. They met at a dance in the spring of 1943, just weeks after the incident at the Ye Old Hob Inn. Elizabeth was 22 years old, the daughter of a coal miner, politically engaged and passionate about workers' rights. She saw Robert as a fellow worker and a fellow human being, and the fact that he was black and American was interesting, but not a barrier to connection. Their relationship developed slowly, beginning with dances and conversations, and growing into genuine affection. Robert introduced Elizabeth to his thinking about racial justice and civil rights, sharing his experiences of segregation and his hopes for a more just future. Elizabeth introduced Robert to socialist political theory and labor organizing, helping him see connections between different forms of struggle. They talked for hours about how the world might be different, about what kind of society they wanted to help build, about whether love could survive across the barriers of race and nationality. When Robert proposed marriage in the fall of 1943, Elizabeth accepted. But they both understood the challenges they would face. Robert would eventually return to America, where interracial marriage was illegal in many states and socially unacceptable in most. Elizabeth would be leaving her family and her country to move somewhere she had never been, somewhere she would face hostility and discrimination because of her choice of partner. They would be building a life together in the face of tremendous opposition, sustained only by their love and their shared commitment to fighting injustice. In the end, their plans were derailed not by social opposition, but by military reassignment. Robert's unit was sent to France in June 1944, and he was wounded in July while working to repair a bridge under bombardment. He survived but was medically evacuated back to the United States before he could return to England. Elizabeth waited for months for word, not knowing if he was alive or dead, finally receiving a letter in September telling her he was recovering in a veterans' hospital in Philadelphia. They continued to write to each other for years, their letters full of love and longing and shared political analysis, but they never saw each other again. Elizabeth eventually married an English veteran and raised a family in Lancashire, but she kept Robert's letters until her death in 2003, a reminder of a love that had briefly transcended the barriers of race and nation. Their story was one of hundreds of similar stories, romances that bloomed briefly in the strange interlude of wartime England and then ended when military reality intervened. Some black soldiers did manage to marry English women and bring them home to America, where they faced exactly the challenges Robert and Elizabeth had anticipated. These couples endured hostility, discrimination, and sometimes violence for their choice to love across racial lines. But they also found communities of support, other interracial couples and allies who believed in their right to build lives together. Their existence challenged the segregationist claim that racial mixing was unnatural or wrong, demonstrating that connection and love could transcend racial categories when people were free to choose. The experiences of black soldiers in England also had unexpected effects on white American soldiers who witnessed them. Some white soldiers reacted with anger and hostility, seeing the English acceptance of black soldiers as a threat to racial order. These were the men who became military police or who supported the efforts to enforce segregation in England. But other white soldiers had their own assumptions challenged by what they observed. They saw black soldiers performing competently and courageously, being welcomed by English civilians, conducting themselves with dignity. Some began to question the racial ideology they had been taught, to wonder whether segregation was really necessary or justified. One such soldier was Private First Class Thomas Mitchell from Wisconsin, who had grown up in a small town where he had never met a black person. He had absorbed the casual racism of his community without really thinking about it, accepting as natural the idea that different races should be kept separate. When he was assigned to work alongside black engineering units in England, he expected to encounter the lazy, incompetent, dangerous people he had been told black people were. Instead, he encountered skilled workers who took pride in their labor, intelligent men who could discuss politics and philosophy, regular people who laughed and joked and worried about their families back home, just like he did. Thomas began to question the things he had been taught. If black soldiers were as competent and intelligent and decent as the men he worked with, why were they treated as inferior? If segregation was about protecting white people from dangerous black people, Why did the English, who had no segregation, seem to be perfectly safe? If racial mixing led to societal breakdown, why was England, with its acceptance of black soldiers socializing with white civilians, functioning just fine? The questions accumulated, eroding his certainty about racial hierarchy. After the conflict, Thomas returned to Wisconsin and became a teacher, and he brought his changed understanding with him. He taught his students about the competence and courage of the black soldiers he had worked with, challenged the racist assumptions that were common in his community, and supported the civil rights movement when it arose. His was a small impact in a small town, but it was part of the larger process by which individual encounters and changed hearts contributed to social transformation. The statistical record of what black engineering battalions accomplished during the war in Europe is staggering and serves as a powerful counter to the racist assumption that they were incapable of important work. The 800th and 17th Engineer Aviation Battalion alone completed over 500 separate construction projects across England and France. They built 27 complete airfields, reconstructed 38 damaged airfields, constructed 412 miles of road, built 67 bridges, and completed countless other tasks. They moved over 3 million cubic yards of earth, laid over 1 million square yards of pavement, and poured over 200,000 cubic yards of concrete. These numbers represent enormous physical labor, technical skill, and organizational capability. When compared to white engineering units performing similar work, black battalions consistently met or exceeded performance standards despite facing numerous additional challenges. They typically received inferior equipment, less training time, and fewer resources than white units. They were often assigned the most difficult and dangerous projects, working in active combat zones or under severe time pressures. Yet they completed their work on schedule and to specification, proving that the racist assumptions about black capability were false. The recognition these units received at the time was minimal. Official reports rarely highlighted their accomplishments, and when they were mentioned, it was often with surprise that black soldiers had performed well, as if competence were unexpected. Medals and commendations went primarily to white units, even when black units had done equivalent or superior work. After the conflict, when veterans returned home and sought recognition for their service, black veterans found that their contributions were systematically minimized or erased from the historical record. It has taken decades of work by historians, often black historians who had to fight for access to archives and resources, to recover the full record of what black soldiers accomplished during the Second World War. The statistics that now exist, the documented achievements of units like the 800th and 17th, stand as powerful refutation of the racist ideology that justified segregation. These numbers prove that when given the opportunity, black soldiers performed as well as any soldiers, that the barriers they faced were imposed by prejudice rather than justified by capability. The personal cost of service in a segregated military, while experiencing temporary equality in England, was enormous and lasting. Many black veterans struggled with depression and anger after returning to America, finding it nearly unbearable to accept degradation after experiencing dignity. Some became active in the civil rights movement, channeling their anger into productive activism. Others withdrew, finding the contrast too painful to bear. Still others tried to recreate in America the sense of equality they had known in England, building communities and institutions where they could experience dignity and respect. For the black soldiers who experienced this welcome, it was transformative not because it solved the problem of racism, but because it proved that racism was not natural or inevitable. They had been raised in a country that taught them, explicitly and implicitly, that they were inferior, that segregation was the natural order of things, that white supremacy was simply how the world worked. England showed them that these teachings were lies, that in other places people saw past skin color to recognize common humanity. That knowledge was powerful and dangerous to the system of oppression they would return to, which is why the American military brass worked so hard to limit contact between black soldiers and English civilians. The friendship between William Crossland and Arthur Twist, maintained through correspondence for nearly 3 decades after the conflict, embodied the lasting impact of that brief period of interaction. Their letters spoke of families and careers, of the changing world around them, of the progress and setbacks in the struggle for racial justice. Arthur followed the American civil rights movement with interest, writing to William about the courage of the protesters and the justice of their cause. William updated Arthur on his teaching career, on his children and grandchildren, on his ongoing efforts to educate young people about history and dignity and equality. Their friendship, unlikely and profound, demonstrated that the connections formed in those wartime years were real and lasting. The broader historical significance of incidents like the one at the Ye Olde Hob Inn lies in what they reveal about the constructed nature of racial prejudice. Segregation required constant enforcement, constant vigilance, constant reinforcement of racial boundaries. When those boundaries were not enforced, when people from different racial backgrounds interacted as equals, the supposed naturalness of racial hierarchy quickly dissolved. This is why segregationists fought so hard to maintain separation, why interracial interaction was seen as dangerous, why the American military police worked to prevent black soldiers from socializing with English civilians. The fear was not that interaction would prove the racist ideology correct, but that it would prove it wrong. The English civilians who welcomed black soldiers were not saints or heroes in their own eyes. Most would have said they were simply behaving decently, treating people with the basic respect all humans deserve. But that decent behavior stood in stark contrast to the system of segregation the American military tried to maintain, and in doing so, it became radical. It challenged fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy, demonstrated that equality was possible, and gave black soldiers an experience they could hold up as proof that the world could be different. Sometimes the most radical act is simply treating people with dignity when the system demands you degrade them. The legacy of these wartime interactions influenced post-war society in both countries in ways that are difficult to quantify, but nonetheless real. The English civilians who had welcomed black soldiers found it harder to accept racial inequality in their own society and in the British Empire. The black soldiers who had experienced equality in England were less willing to accept inequality at home and became participants in the civil rights movement. The white American soldiers who had witnessed English acceptance of black soldiers had their own assumptions challenged, though their responses varied widely from rejection of segregation to angry defense of it. The ripples spread outward, touching more lives than anyone involved could have anticipated. What happened at the Ye Olde Hob Inn on that March evening in 1943 was simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. It was ordinary in the sense that it was simply a pub owner serving customers and defending them against harassment. It was extraordinary in the context of the time, a moment when someone chose to stand up against systemic injustice despite the personal and professional risks. That combination of the ordinary and the extraordinary is what makes the story so powerful and so instructive. It reminds us that resistance to injustice does not always require grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it is as simple as treating people with the dignity they deserve, regardless of what the system demands. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.